You're listening to BigWorldNetwork.
Bloodshot Buck, Season 2, Episode 5. Written by W.H. Wood and Mitch K. Allan. Read by Willow Wood. Neni estimated that she had a freak-out in the toilet between 10 to 20 times a day. Once she tried to count them, but got tired of it somewhere after breakdown number 15. If she could just have one day, she thought to herself, one day to get these panic attacks out of her system, maybe run a bath, reread her favourite book, or... But those were stupid daydreams now. Criminals on the run didn't get to relax in bathtubs. The real problem was having nowhere to go. The cramped shuttle closed in on her. What little space remained was full up with 2 grumbling men who didn't want to be there and didn't know how they'd get out. All Neni could do was slam the wobbly door shut on them, as though she could push away all her responsibilities and decisions with them. 3 square meters, where the consequences of this total clusterfuck of an escape attempt didn't exist, even if most of that floor space was taken up by a toilet. Neni didn't know if the other 2 were trying to respect her need for solitude, or if they wanted to avoid her as much as she avoided them, but they both learnt quickly to hold it in as long as possible, only knocking on the bathroom door when they were really desperate. But claustrophobic conditions only became unbearable when she tried to sleep. Arkadash insisted on trying to keep a regular 24-hour cycle, although really, what was the point? 2 bunks folded out of the shuttle's ceiling compartment, a third one from the floor, and the last doubled as an uncomfortable couch on the starboard side of the shuttle. They left the couch as it was, and Neni chose the bunk above in a desperate bid to have a little privacy and peace. Not that it mattered. She could have slept in the fuel tank, and Dristan's constant fidgeting would have kept her awake. Out of every 8 hours that Mommy Ark dictated as nighttime, Dristan Potts would spend 7 of them flinging himself around his tough mattress, whining and coughing. Then Arkadash would start mumbling something reassuring and fatherly down to him, and that was it. Neni lay awake, glaring at the ceiling, whilst one rumbling voice and one squeaky one chatted away all night. Of course, Dristan appeared to catch up on all his missed sleep by dozing uselessly on the lumpy couch for most of the next day. "I could just smother him with a pillow," Neni said once.
"Neni,"
Arkadash sighed, with no heat to his words. He never spoke in any tone other than exhausted these days. "I know," she said, "but I could." Dristan and Arkadash got along so well, at least under the circumstances, that Neni thought perhaps if she opened up a little, like they did with each other, it might alleviate some of her misery. Sure, neither of them was thrilled about being trapped in space, and they frequently mused about getting caught or running into any number of disastrous scenarios, or missing their old lives. But in between that, they coexisted peaceably enough. Neni just had to do the same, chatter away insufferably like Dristan did. So, after the first week, she settled into the flight control chair beside Arkadash, whilst Dristan snored faintly on the couch. "I can't hear properly," she said. Arkadash turned to her and with his seemingly endless patience said,
"Okay."
"Since we got on the shuttle," Neni explained, "everything sounds hollow. Have you ever noticed it? I feel like something's missing. Something doesn't sound right." Arkadash took a breath to say something, but she cut him off. "Not just that it's a small space. I've been in shuttles before, with Hara and Arzama, and..." don't say his name. And it's something different. I'm kind of freaking out about it. Arkadash blinked hard a couple of times.
Right, he said.
A segment in the back of her brain filed away Ark's curt responses, his tired eyes, to be examined later, when she'd be staring at the ceiling and pretending to sleep. When she'd wonder where the Ark who threw himself across the room to pat her hand and murmur something comforting had gone, and who this large, weary man was instead. But Neni breezed past, trying to ignore it, because all she had to do was explain it right, and he'd know the right thing to say. He always knew the right thing to say. I think I might have put myself back together wrong, she said. For real this time. Nothing could hide the way Arkadash's eyes rolled.
Not this again.
I'm serious! Neni took a breath, lowered her voice back down. Stop pushing. Don't push him away. You're asking for help. I'm serious, she repeated. I was in a rush. We all were. And the shuttle was leaving. It was chaos. I was all over the place. I think I blacked out. She reached a hand up and tugged on her earlobe. Do you know how complicated ears are? They might look normal on the outside, but it's fine hairs and delicate bones. If any of them are out of alignment...
Neni, I don't think it's possible to reform wrong, Arkadash said. It seems to me that justicates don't have to concentrate. It just sort of happens.
Neni tugged harder on her earlobe, keeping a sudden "how the fuck would you know" behind her teeth. You know what? She said airily. Don't worry about it. Arkadash sighed and passed a hand over his eyes.
Neni.
No. She forced a smile and brought Justice Joyful back with a vengeance. It's fine. I'm being silly.
That's not what I said. You're stressed.
So are you. You don't need me adding paranoia. She punched his arm playfully, as though she didn't feel like crying. I can man the fort. Go to sleep. You look like shit. Even his snort was a dismal, pathetic sound. He tapped the dash display.
But it's...
I don't care what time it is. Get out of here. Arkadash just nodded, stifling a yawn, and levered himself out of his chair. Neni fixed her gaze on the viewport, waiting for Ark to curl up on one of the bunks. She threw the fixed grin out the window and covered her mouth with a shaky hand. Well, of course he got on so well with Dristan. They were both normal. They were just two average guys stuck in a crazy accident. How could they relate to a woman who turned into a blood monster and who couldn't hear properly and kept obsessively checking her fingerprints to see if they'd always whirled to the left? Maybe my ears are broken. Maybe her side effects were finally catching up to her. Now she'd hit rock bottom, running on fumes. Ark and Dristan couldn't hear blood surging through their legs. They didn't know how it felt as an extension of themselves. Consciousness had never surged out of their body in a single dizzying moment of liquid freedom. The only people who understood, the only people like her, were back on that rock she'd fled, or in prison cells. No, not cells. It was do your job or demolition for synth soldiers. All the other half-alien messes like herself were now fighting against her, or already dead. I didn't want that, she realized, too late. She sobbed as quietly as she could, staring out into cold space. I didn't mean to give that up too. Would she have got over it? If she'd stayed, if she'd done her placement on Earth, would the squeamishness have disappeared? Would John be her friend? Would... Neni balled her fists and pushed them hard against her eyelids until she saw swirly lights. Listen. Breathe deep and listen. Try to hear the thing that's missing. It had to be somewhere. It wasn't the silence of drifting through space, or their pet civilian would be losing it too. But he was fine, breathing softly in and out. That was all Neni could hear. Dristan's snores, Ark shuffling around on the bed, and a faint whistle as she sniffed through her runny nose. What else could there be? Did she have Cathar ears now? Did they hear a different frequency to humans? Were there tones they couldn't pick up? Neni clapped her hands over her ears and listened to her rushing blood instead. It took a month of crawling around the asteroid belt at an agonizing pace to find a rock big enough to house a fuel station, but small enough not to arouse suspicion. They'd passed 2 larger asteroids a few weeks ago, cruising close enough to see the glimmering lights and docking bays that screamed government. But when Ark called Neni out from the bathroom one day, she saw a rock that must have been at least 50 kilometers across. The side facing them bore the scars of a small, abandoned mining operation, twisted metal structures reaching out into the vacuum of space. But as Ark brought the shuttle underneath the asteroid, the cluster of worn, outdated vessels that clung to its surface became visible, along with a few shacks of corrugated iron holding up a patchy at-dome. "A junkyard?" Neni asked. Ark shook his head.
That's what I thought, but it's broadcasting a continuous hail.
He hit a button on the dashboard. An orange data stream lit up across the screen, text scrolling merrily along, advertising each type of fuel supplied at the station. At the end of each cycle, a smiling face with a thumbs up followed, amongst a string of asterisks and too many exclamation marks. Before Neni could open her mouth to complain about a sudden migraine, a shrill, tinny voice echoed around the small shuttle as the ad's audio kicked in, distorted by both the broadcast distance and the shoddy equipment.
"Howdy, boys!"
it blared.
"All out of gas. For fuels and repairs, stop by old Joe's. No questions asked."
"I hate him already," Neni said. Dristan, who had been slumped listlessly in the co-pilot seat, stared at the dazzling text with wild eyes. He breathed. "It's so tacky." "It's a drug-running front," Neni corrected. "I mean, old Joe's? Come on." Dristan blinked up at her. "But it's a space cowboy drug-running front." "Dristan, look! Those ships are older than you." Neni stared out the viewport as the shuttle circled the asteroid again. "That antenna is older than me," she said, startled.
How else do you think they broadcast this to moving ships?
Ark rumbled.
Looks like they pinched it from the mine.
Neni frowned. "Our ship is the prettiest. We're going to stand out a bit." Dristan leant forward in his seat. "What we need is a pirate king around, with one of those slimline cruisers. Then everyone would egg that instead while we land." "Yes, why make shady deals with drug dealers when we could run into a pirate lord?"
"Settle down,"
Arkadash said, bringing the shuttle into a steep approach.
"Let's hope old Joe wants a spare proton cannon."
Arkadash quickly made the connection between antenna and news reports, and Neni agreed that he and Dristan should go trade for fuel while she stayed on the ship. She agreed for a whole 10 minutes until they disappeared behind the ranks of filthy ancient ships, and she jumped out to stretch her legs for the first time in a month. The 3 of them together looked conspicuous enough, but after weeks of the same clothes and a tiny shower of recycled water, Neni wasn't sure she'd even recognize herself. Her first priority was to put as much space between herself and the boys as possible, pacing in the other direction. All that time being just feet away from each other, and now she couldn't even see them. Bliss. No coughing, no mumbling, no harsh, bitten-off sentences. Just the hum of the wonky at-dome, the occasional clink of rusty shuttle hulls, and... Neni turned her head from side to side rapidly and stuck her fingers in her ears a few times. Was this really happening?
There is a god, and he lives at Old Joe's asteroid. Who knew?
She could hear again. Ark must have been right. The cramped shuttle was the problem. Neni clapped her hands loudly twice, afraid it might disappear as quickly as it had returned. No, back to normal. All normal. Just like always. Was it always like this? Now she'd learnt to miss it, Neni couldn't be sure it was natural at all. Like a ringing in her ears, but stranger. More melodic. She just needed to get used to it again. But the further away from the ship, the louder it hummed, brushing the base of her hearing. Did something in the shuttle block it out? Or was it coming from another direction instead of inside her head? Neni tripped over her own feet and put her arms out, expecting to hit the walls of the shuttle, and finding nothing instead. No walls anywhere. There was too much space. Above her head, the atdome fizzled pathetically, doing nothing to hide the blackness that went on forever, and the stars, and she never thought she'd wish for that horrid little bathroom again, but where were the walls? She needed to lie down. She needed to slip back into her bunk. Her ears were wonderful, wonderful, but weird and spooky, and she just needed to find somewhere to...
"What are you doing?"
a voice asked, and somewhere in her delirium, Neni managed to notice the bass thrum that accompanied Catharian's speech.
"You can't be sick here. This battery is worth more than me."
Bony fingers dug into her shoulder. Neni blinked through blotchy dark spots and tried to focus on the figure in front of her.
"A little early in the day to be drinking, yes?
Not," Neni mumbled, shaking her head to clear it. The wave of nausea passed as quickly as it had arrived.
"Space sick, then,"
the Cathar said, letting go of her. It was a statement. Neni nodded, taking in the fuller face and high neck that indicated the Cathar was a male. Their tough shells always made it difficult to age a Cathar, but Neni recognized the way this one loosened his carapace around his eyes and mouth as a sign of his relative youth. The act revealed creamy, semi-transparent skin and a spiderweb of blood vessels that glowed underneath, absorbing and refracting light. No alien back on the synth quarter would dare open up like that, but she remembered from her home on Mars that many teenage Cathar would relax their armored masks to speak with humans more clearly. Even with his carapace relaxed, Neni found it hard to read his eyes, but it looked like he was squinting at her. Suspicious or concerned?
"How long?"
he asked. "Sorry?" Now the beady eyes were definitely narrowed. The Catharian waved his 4-digited hand in front of her face.
"You have got it bad. How long have you been in space?"
He spaced each word out carefully, raising his voice. Neni swiped his hand away. "I can hear just fine, thanks." Too bad her vision was starting to blur and darken again. "A month." Was that too obvious? Was the synth quarter the only populated settlement a month away? "Maybe more," she mumbled. The Catharian seemed to attribute her hesitance to delirium, as he was already climbing up the steps into his ship, half listening.
"I have something for that. It works well on humans, too."
Then he disappeared into the shuttle.
"Make a note. The locals are friendly."
That, or she was about to take psychedelic alien drugs. The Catharian's ship looked a little bigger than the shuttle they'd stolen from the synth quarter. It probably housed a room for flight control and another separate space for sleeping. Either this guy was rolling in it to buy a ship twice the size he needed, or he was sharing. But someone rolling in cash probably wouldn't have the tail end of their ship open, trailing its innards across the ground. Neni didn't know much about shuttles, but this looked like one huge repair job. A new battery was the least of its problems. She crouched down to take a closer look inside the open battery hatch, but none of the components appeared to match the ones in their stolen shuttle. She reached inside to run her thumb over the burnt-out resistor. Pity. He seemed friendly enough to give them a good deal in exchange for parts. If push came to shove, they could even buy a lift.
What am I thinking? The last thing I need is more people.
Nenni leapt to her feet, wincing as she snagged her palm on a jagged metal edge inside the hatch.
Someone take a chunk out of your ship?
She called into the doorway, pressing down hard on the shallow cut.
Your ship sure took a chunk out of my hand.
The Cathar's disgusted sigh was muffled, but audible from inside.
Fuel pipe blew and took half my engine with it. Battery, everything, ruined. We were dead in the water until we got a tow.
He reappeared in the shadowy doorway, clutching a small box.
This kakarak sold us the repair job in the first place.
He waved vaguely in the direction of old Joe's.
He's replaced my battery, but he's a slippery asshole, and we're still negotiating the rest.
Just the person I want to be selling a high-power ship weapon to.
Starting to wish I picked another fuel station, Nenni said. The Cathar shrugged.
If it's fuel you want, no problem. I've been using this place for years. Repairs, you're better off doing yourself.
He passed down the small box of pills.
Here, we usually give them to children, so you'll want double the dose. It's uncommon to see space sickness in someone so old.
I'm not used to space travel, Nenni said defensively.
And I'm 32, thank you.
Another shrug.
Humans, you all look alike.
Looks like old Joe isn't the only kakarak on this rock.
Nenni thought, before popping 2 of the chalky white pills into her mouth. Dry.
Nasty cut you have,
the Cathar continued. Nenni nodded, putting pressure on it again and indicating the ship's repair job.
Trying to see if I could help you out. But we don't have any parts going spare. I've had worse.
Good thing you're not one of those synths, eh?
Nenni whipped her head up and wondered if he'd always been standing so close. He had the high ground, still perched a couple of steps above her.
I hear one cut and they go crazy, he said.
Do they? Nenni said weakly. At his belt, the Catharian wore what was almost definitely a photon pistol, and it would almost definitely blow a hole through her chest before she could speak. Had he been wearing that before? Surely she'd have remembered. Was that why he went into the shuttle? Grab his gun, maybe send a message to the synth quarter. The Cathar was still talking, mild as ever, apparently ignorant of Nenni's churning stomach.
Especially those just. They can do anything with just a drop. Or something like that.
He's just making conversation,
Nenni thought, pressing down on her cut until it hurt. That, or a Cathar could smell alien blood in her veins. What if Cathar could smell alien blood in her veins?
What if I did just take alien psychedelic drugs?
Well, you can't believe everything you see on the vid shows, she said, adding a light chuckle that sounded more like a nervous wheeze. The Cathar paused, and maybe his carapace was a little tighter than earlier.
Oh, of course not. They are fantastical.
She took a few steps backwards. Lucky for us. She handed back the little box of pills that hopefully weren't poison. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I should go see about my ship.
I see. I'll be here for a while yet, if you need more of these,
the Cathar said, rattling the small box.
I am Kasim Kasivovich.
She waited for the obligatory, but you can call me, that accompanied almost every Catharian introduction. To insist on full names was considered cold, even between strangers. But no, Kasim Kasivovich it was. Nona, Nenni stammered, hoping the omission of her surname was just as much an insult. but his voice had the same mild, amused tone.
I hope you feel better,
he said as she began to walk away.
And sorry about your hand.
Old Joe's was not quite the space cowboy paradise Tristan had envisioned, but it would certainly do. The floor was dusty, the place stank, and its few occupants were surly and suspicious. Sure, it would have been better if one of them had an eye patch or a horrific-looking scar, but you couldn't win them all. The lights were flashing, the music was blaring, and Tristan was standing beside the buffest-looking man he'd ever known. He knew Arkadash was filling his pants by the way he clenched his hands like a taut rubber band, but he managed to look professional about it all the same. Grade A military man right there. Joe's assistant was tied up in a heated argument with a female trader that looked set to go on all day, so it was Joe himself that hopped out to take a look at the cannon. He made the appropriate whistling noises before saying,
"Where'd you get a nice shiny vessel like this anyway? Looks like it'd fit in well with the Mars fleet."
Tristan and Arkadash both gaped like fish for a moment before Joe roared with laughter.
"Oh, I'm kidding. No questions asked, right? Let's just say you acquired it."
He thinks we're pirates, Tristan thought, with both dread and excitement. He actually thinks we're pirates.
"Problem with beauties like these is they only take military-grade fuel," Joe said. "And military-grade fuel is a thing I just do not have."
Couldn't we adapt the fuel tank or the engine or take something else?
Arkadash asked. Joe frowned.
"Mighty big job. And even then, it'd only last you a week."
He looked up at the At-Dome.
"Ain't getting far out from here in a week."
Arkadash put his head in his hands.
"Course,"
old Joe hummed.
Yes?
Arkadash and Tristan chorused.
"Course, if you wanted to stick around, I might have a supply of the stuff coming in on a don't ask, don't tell basis. 2 weeks from now."
2 weeks,
Arkadash echoed, glancing at Tristan. No way was Nenni going to be happy with sitting on this rock for 2 weeks.
I'm not sure we have that long,
Arkadash said. Old Joe's grin showed dirty brown teeth.
"You boys feel free to zip around the galaxy on films then, if you like. Course, if you did stick around."
He patted the proton cannon protectively.
"For such a mighty fine gun, I'd be willing to do any repairs for free, given that you'd not be going anywhere fast."
After a few minutes furiously brainstorming ways to tell this to Nenni, without her exploding into a giant blood goop of rage, the boys had their decision made for them by Nenni's reappearance. Tristan tensed at the sight of her, shrinking a little behind Arkadash, because oh yay, didn't he just love getting the Clara look from her as well? The good old, "Why are you alive?" glare. She wandered from between the ranks of abandoned shuttles, face a little green. If she thought it was odd that they were standing around outside the ship instead of pumping gas into it, she didn't show it. Arkadash had clearly been preparing a "where have you been?" but it died on his lips and turned into,
"Are you all right?"
Nenni swayed and glanced between the two of them. I think I may have run into an undercover Justicat.
Music by Kevin MacLeod.
You're listening to BigWorldNetwork.